He drove through that relentless storm, anticipation still pulsing in his veins, imagining the smile on his twins' faces when he surprised them on a random evening, only to find emptiness, cold air, and two tiny shapes soaked by rain and abandoned by the woman he believed would love them more than anyone. His heart shattered, his hands trembled, and anger roared inside him as he realized the mother of his children had walked away without a backward glance, leaving them exposed to the elements without a hint of remorse. A father's love is fierce and unwavering, and nothing conjures fury faster than betrayal that leaves your own flesh in peril. But the question, that searing question, lingered. Why would she do this? What he discovered next wasn't just betrayal. It was a revelation that would upend everything he thought he knew. Who was this woman really? The one who once stood at the altar with a radiant smile. The one who promised forever but disappeared into the shadows of a rain-soaked night, leaving her newborn twins crying in the cold. Why did she abandon them? And what secret was heavy enough to make her heart turn to stone against the very children she brought into this world? To the outside world, she was a doting wife and mother, a woman who appeared to have everything, but behind the walls of their home something far more complicated was unraveling. Every photograph from their wedding day looked perfect. Every moment in the hospital when the twins were born seemed like joy written in time. Yet the empty crib in the rain spoke louder than any vow she ever made. This story isn't just about abandonment. It's about deception, trust shattered beyond repair, and the shocking truth about the woman who left two helpless babies in the storm. The father was a hard-working man named David, respected by his neighbors and known in his community for his dedication to family, church, and work. He wasn't a man of excess. He carried traditional values handed down from his own father: discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. To those who knew him best, David was the sort of man who placed responsibility above convenience, the kind who dreamed of building a strong household where his children would grow surrounded by love, stability, and faith. His pride and joy came when his twins were born, and he held them in the hospital with tears that soaked their blankets. In that moment, he felt the future stretching before him, every choice from then on guided by the promise that he would never let them down. He believed his new wife shared those dreams with him, and he trusted her completely, blind to the storm that lay ahead. His wife, Margaret, was a woman who seemed to wear kindness like a crown in public. She laughed easily, remembered names, and smiled in photographs like she was built to be admired. To outsiders, she was the perfect picture of charm, the young mother who appeared devoted to her children and unwavering in her marriage. Yet behind closed doors, David began to notice subtle things, small moments where her affection seemed practiced, times when her eyes lingered elsewhere, as though her heart was absent, even when her body was present. In church, she carried herself like a model of faith, but late at night, she took long phone calls in whispers. She brushed them off as harmless, but in David's heart, a small unease began to grow, though he quickly buried it under trust. He believed in her as much as he believed in the vows they made, not knowing that faith in the wrong person can turn into a blade pressed against your very soul. Their home was filled with moments that, on the surface, looked like any other young family's. David came home from long shifts to find Margaret cooking, the twins in their high chairs, and laughter bouncing off the walls. There were trips to the park, family photographs carefully arranged, and dinners where neighbors complimented how lucky David was to have such a picture-perfect wife. And yet, beneath the surface of that life, cracks quietly widened. Neighbors whispered about seeing Margaret out alone, dressed as though she were going somewhere important, but never saying where. Friends mentioned how she always seemed distracted, quick to step outside when her phone buzzed. At first, David dismissed it as gossip. He told himself every couple faces pressures, and Margaret was no different. But deep down, the doubts festered, and he could not silence the quiet voice that told him something was wrong. There were nights when Margaret left the twins with David and claimed she needed time for herself. Sometimes she was gone for hours, returning with vague excuses and the faint smell of perfume not her own. David's love made him blind, and his loyalty made him silent. He chose not to question her, afraid of what answers might come if he did. But every unanswered phone call, every abrupt departure, every restless glance at the clock pushed him closer to an invisible edge. The home that should have been his sanctuary was slowly turning into a stage where appearances masked truth. And yet, he clung to the idea that love could conquer doubt. He convinced himself she was simply struggling with the weight of motherhood, with the responsibility of raising twins. But deep down, in the chambers of his heart, David knew he was standing in the shadow of a betrayal he had not yet uncovered. And then, one stormy night, he came home early. That night the storm came without warning, sheets of rain hammering the streets as if the sky itself had split apart. David left work earlier than expected, eager to return to the warmth of his home, imagining Margaret and the twins waiting for him. He carried with him the simple joy of a man who lived for family. But as he turned onto his street, something immediately felt wrong. The lights of the house were dim, shadows stretched across the windows, and then, cutting through the roar of the rain, he heard it. Faint cries, thin and desperate, piercing through the storm. His heart lurched, and he ran toward the sound, his clothes soaked, his breath ragged. There, on the porch in the freezing rain, lay his newborn twins, fragile and vulnerable, their tiny arms trembling as water soaked their blankets. For a moment, he could not breathe. Shock anchored his body while fury tore at his chest. David scooped the twins into his arms, his hands trembling as he wrapped his coat around their shivering bodies. Anger surged through him like fire, but beneath it was disbelief so heavy it threatened to crush him. Where was Margaret? What kind of mother would leave her children outside, abandoned to the mercy of a storm? The questions clawed at his mind, each one more unbearable than the last. He stumbled inside, hoping to find her in the kitchen, perhaps distracted, perhaps unaware. But the house was empty. Silence swallowed every corner. The rooms that should have been filled with warmth felt hollow, stripped of safety, echoing with the cries of two children who had been left behind. David searched frantically, calling her name, his voice cracking under the weight of rage and fear. But there was no answer, only the relentless storm hammering against the windows like a cruel reminder that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Neighbors noticed the commotion as David rushed back outside with the twins in his arms, their cries loud enough to draw concern through the rain. Lights flickered on across the street, doors opened, and soon neighbors gathered, faces pale with disbelief as they tried to understand what they were seeing. A father, drenched and broken, clutching two infants who had been abandoned, not by fate, not by accident, but by the very woman meant to protect them. Questions swirled among the whispers. Where was Margaret? Why would she do this? What secret could have driven her to turn her back on her children? The police were called, sirens cutting through the storm, adding another layer of urgency to the chaos. And as officers stepped onto the porch, flashlights scanning the drenched surroundings, David knew this night had changed everything. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't neglect born of carelessness. This was something far darker. The investigation began the very night David found his twins in the storm. Police combed through the house, flashlights illuminating corners that should have spoken of family, but instead revealed emptiness. Margaret was nowhere to be found. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her belongings untouched, but the woman herself had vanished as if swallowed by the rain. Officers questioned David, neighbors, anyone who might have seen her that evening, but no one had answers. Within 24 hours, the story broke in local headlines. Young mother disappears after abandoning newborn twins in the rain. The community erupted with outrage, disbelief, and questions that refused to settle. How could a mother walk away? Why would she leave two helpless infants at the mercy of a storm? As days passed, anger spread beyond the neighborhood, becoming a matter of public debate. The kind of story that ignites fury because it feels like an offense to every parent who ever sacrificed for their children. Theories began to emerge, each one darker than the last. Some whispered that Margaret had run away with another man, lured by promises that outweighed loyalty. Others believed her motives were rooted in money, insurance policies, or hidden debts she could not face. A few questioned whether she had ever truly loved David or the twins at all, or if the life she built was only an illusion waiting to collapse. Investigators pulled threads, searching for anything that explained her sudden disappearance. They found unexplained withdrawals from joint accounts, whispers of secret phone calls, and late-night messages that suggested someone else was waiting in the shadows of Margaret's life. David, overwhelmed, tried to make sense of it all while still caring for his children, balancing bottles and sleepless nights with endless interviews at the police station. He was no longer just a father. He was a man searching for truth in a maze of betrayal. Red herrings clouded the case and fueled speculation. A male co-worker was questioned after witnesses claimed to have seen him and Margaret together more than once outside the office. Money transfers traced to accounts under names David had never heard of raised suspicions of fraud. Even more startling, police discovered evidence of a fake ID linked to Margaret, suggesting she had been planning an escape long before the stormy night she disappeared. Each revelation only deepened the mystery, leaving the community torn between pity for David and horror at the possibility that Margaret's betrayal was far greater than anyone had imagined. The media devoured every new lead, broadcasting headlines that cut deep into David's soul. How could a mother abandon her newborn twins? News anchors debated her motives while neighbors spoke to cameras about the woman they thought they knew, painting a portrait of charm hiding secrets. For David, the weight of it all became unbearable. He moved through his days in a haze, tending to the twins with trembling hands, haunted by the memory of finding them alone in the rain. Nights were the worst, when silence filled the house, and he wondered if Margaret was out there laughing, hiding, or perhaps planning something more cruel than he had yet imagined. His once steadfast trust was shattered, replaced by a relentless need to uncover the truth. He clung to police updates, sat through endless interviews, and opened doors to detectives at all hours, each time hoping this would be the moment he learned why. But the answers never came quickly. Instead, the case seemed to stretch endlessly, feeding the storm of speculation that grew louder with every passing day. And then, investigators uncovered something that changed everything. The weeks of confusion and unanswered questions finally gave way to a revelation that stunned everyone who had followed the case. Investigators disclosed that Margaret had not acted alone. Her disappearance wasn't simply a flight of desperation. It was carefully orchestrated with someone else. Police unearthed a trail of messages between Margaret and a man identified as her secret lover. Messages that painted a portrait of manipulation and deceit. This man fed her lies about freedom, about escape, about building a new life away from the responsibility of marriage and children. It became clear that Margaret had been pulled into a relationship built on deception, where every word pushed her further from the family she once vowed to protect. What began as whispers of doubt had transformed into undeniable proof that betrayal wasn't only hers. It was shared with someone lurking in the shadows, driving her every choice. Financial motives soon came to the surface. Investigators found evidence of an insurance policy in David's name, one Margaret had quietly taken out months before. Alongside it were bank statements revealing hidden debts Margaret had concealed. Debts that weighed heavily enough to force her toward desperate decisions. The combination of financial pressure and her lover's influence created a storm inside her that she chose to unleash on David and the twins. But it was the confession tapes that shocked the public the most, recordings from police interrogations where Margaret's voice cut through like a knife. "I never wanted these children," she admitted coldly. "He forced me into this life. I wanted freedom, not this prison of responsibility." The words echoed across headlines, a mother's denial of love for the children she had brought into the world, sealing the depth of her betrayal. When the case finally reached the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with disbelief and anger. David stood holding his twins, their small faces pressed against his chest, as the truth unfolded before the eyes of the community. The courtroom reenactments, the testimonies, and the evidence all converged into one unavoidable truth. Margaret had chosen betrayal over family, driven by greed, secrecy, and the promises of another man. Witness after witness recounted her absences, her cold demeanor, her carefully hidden lies, until the portrait of the woman David once trusted was shattered beyond recognition. For him, every moment in that courtroom was a reminder that the vows they exchanged had meant nothing to her. Each revelation was like salt in a wound that would never truly heal. The emotional climax came as the verdict was read, but for David, it wasn't justice that filled his heart, it was devastation. Betrayal had been fully revealed, and there was no path back to the life he once knew. He had uncovered the truth, but the cost was a broken trust, a fractured family, and the haunting knowledge that the woman he once loved had never truly been who she claimed to be. Just when David thought the storm of betrayal had fully passed, when he believed the worst had already been uncovered in the courtroom, another revelation surfaced, one that struck harder than anything before. Investigators found correspondence between Margaret and her lover that revealed a chilling plan. She had been preparing to sell custody of the twins in exchange for money. To her, the children were not lives to be nurtured, not souls to be cherished, but bargaining chips to erase debts and fuel a fantasy of freedom. The discovery was an emotional gut punch, a betrayal so profound that even those who had followed every twist of the case were left stunned into silence. For David, the realization was unbearable. To imagine that the woman he once trusted above all else had not only abandoned their children, but had considered selling their futures, was the deepest wound of all. The resolution came with the gavel's echo. The court awarded David full custody of the twins, granting him sole guardianship and protection over the two small lives that had already suffered too much. Margaret, exposed for the truth of her actions, faced the consequences of her choices while David stood as both father and protector, a man determined to rebuild from the ashes of betrayal. He cradled his children with a fierceness born of love and pain, vowing in his heart that they would never again know abandonment, that they would never feel the cold sting of rain as long as he lived. His promise was simple but unbreakable. He would raise them with honor, with strength, and with the steadfast devotion that Margaret had refused to give. And in the quiet that followed the storm, David reflected on the journey that had nearly destroyed him. Trust, once broken, is never the same. It becomes a scar, a reminder etched deep into the soul. Yet sometimes betrayal clears the path for true strength. Out of Margaret's lies, David found an unshakable resolve, a deeper bond with his children, and a purpose that could never be stolen. He walked forward not as a man consumed by what he lost, but as a father defined by what he refused to surrender. In the final moments, as he held the twins close and stepped into the light of a new day, one truth remained unshaken. No matter the cost, he would never abandon them. In the end, as David stood with his twins safe in his arms, the world could not help but ask the same haunting questions that lingered like shadows over the case. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Could you have found the strength to forgive a betrayal so deep, so merciless that it nearly shattered the foundation of everything you believed in? Or was forgiveness impossible, a bridge too broken to ever be rebuilt? For David, forgiveness was never the answer. Protection was. His only mission became ensuring that his children would never again face the cruelty of abandonment, that they would grow up surrounded by love untainted by deceit. And yet, the dilemma remains for all of us who watch his story. Where does the line between justice and mercy truly lie? And could any of us endure the weight of such betrayal without being broken? But if you thought David's ordeal was shocking, if you believed you had seen the depths of deception revealed in Margaret's actions, then you must prepare yourself for what comes next. Because in another story, in another home filled with secrets, there was a wife who did the unthinkable. She faked her own death, disappearing into the silence of grief, only to reappear at her husband's wedding, alive, vengeful, and prepared to tear apart every illusion he had built in her absence. That story, like David's, reminds us that betrayal wears many faces, and the truth, when it finally comes to light, is often more devastating than anything we could imagine. So before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.